Howdy. In today's lesson, we're going to be talking a little more in depth about what addiction actually is, what's actually going on when we are talking about addiction. Most of us look at the outside behaviors that are happening and we go, that's addiction, or what we're consuming, whether that's an actual substance or visually like pornography or food or whatever it is, right? We think that that thing is the addiction, that behavior is the addiction or is the problem. That's not really true. For as far as things are going out in the world, yes, that's what that looks like, and it seems to be how it affects our life, but that's not entirely what's going on. So in today's lesson, I want to talk about, in simple terms, fear not, what is actually going on internally with addiction and how we come to be that way and why it is so problematic for so many of us. It is said by the American Medical Association, the World Health Organization, that addiction is a chronic brain disease. That used to really freak me out and kind of piss me off. I heard disease and interpreted it as weak or less than or sick or unfixable, unrepairable. It didn't sit right with me until I learned what disease actually means. And what it really means is a malfunction of a structure or a function. So it's kind of a broken functioning that usually has signs and symptoms. That's it. That's what we're talking about. And chronic means that it persists over a long time or is reoccurring. Okay, yeah, that actually sounds pretty spot on with my experience with addiction. Signs and symptoms, of course, being my reacting out behavior or using, and then doing that over and over and over again. Yeah, that is chronic. So when you hear addiction talked about as a brain disease, that's what they are talking about, that we have a malfunction of a structure, which for us is our brain. That also includes our neurotransmitters, our brain chemicals, and the things that get us to do what the brain wants us to do. Once upon a time, long, long ago, things like high caloric food, sugar, social interactions, and sex were all harder to come by and really, really important. So we developed a reward system in the brain that would reward the behavior that was going to benefit our lives and the survival of our species. We think about that with things like food and water, of course, but there are other things that are tied into that as well that have been perceived to be required for our survival. Now, the brain's number one job, though it is amazing and does many, many things, its number one job is to keep us alive. It will always prioritize that. Now, there's been a huge shift in availability of things, but the brain doesn't change that quickly as far as its biological makeup when we're talking about things that have evolved over, however long. So things like, yes, sex were required for the survival of our species. So the brain has a built-in system to encourage us to engage in that behavior or other things. Eating, even alcohol is a form of socializing and bonding, and all of the stuff that we don't think about as part of survival nowadays, once upon a time was. And that's where the brain is still living, in that once upon a time, right? And we are kind of just falling into that. Now we're going to talk about the reward system and the chemical dopamine. We're going to keep it really simple, though there's a lot going on with addiction and all of the structures and the vagus nerve and all of this stuff, but we're going to keep it really simple for our purposes today, just so we understand what's going on and what we can do about it. I know we have a lot of, for many of us, shame and guilt and frustration built up in our actual behaviors, how we are harmful to others, how we do seemingly insane things, how we want to stop, but we can't. And we look at that and we go, that's the addiction, that's the problem. Those really are symptoms. Those are signs and symptoms of what is actually going on in that malfunction of our brain structure. Part of the reward system are these what are called hedonic hotspots. They are things that store pleasurable images and memories and things to help encourage us to continue seeking out the substance or behavior that is helping us and or our species stay alive. So when we engage in things that are deemed in that, we're going to talk about sex specifically, since that's what most of us in here are having as our primary area of addiction. In short, when we engage in anything in that realm, now we know that can go anywhere from fantasy or just thinking about it to watching pornography or engaging in actual intercourse with someone. It is a big, wide spectrum. All of the things that are tied to in our brain sexual activity are part of this reward system and play into those hedonic hotspots. Now, those are important because that is why sometimes we have really weird triggers and we're like, why is that? Why am I, triggered by this right now? And it's because a memory has actually been stored in a way that your brain has made it feel positive so that you'll do that thing again. Now, it never intended for there to be so much access and abundance of these things. Like back in the day, if you were watching sex, you were probably having it, right? Or it was someone in your tribe. It was very small. This was not happening all the time. We didn't have a device that we could just watch and watch and watch and watch. That wasn't a thing. Like there wasn't ice cream or, cheeseburgers and things like that either. So when we have that, we kind of think of it like pushing a button that then releases a reward. And because it's tied into that reward system, which is in our limbic system, it's tied to our survival. So every time the button's pushed, it goes, hey, this is keeping you alive. This feels really good. Keep doing this. We need this for survival. Does that make sense at this day? No, it does not. Do we need sex or pornography or any of that for our survival? No, we don't. However, it doesn't matter. The brain is programmed that way. Just there you go. That's what's going on, right? So say we are looking at pornography early on, right? It pushes that button and it goes, hey, do this thing. This feels good. It goes into those hedonic hotspots, which then create positive memories to encourage you to do that thing again. And then you do it again and you push the button and your brain goes, ooh, survival. We need this thing. Do. Feels good. Yeah, do that thing. And then you're like, oh, don't mind if I do. Boop. And we push it again, right? And the brain goes, yes, continue this behavior. It doesn't have a filter or a way of going, this is too much too often. I don't know about this. That's not part of that system. And you have to remember our limbic system, our survival system is part of the oldest part of the brain. It is our fight and flight. It is where we have so much of our instincts, where we can perceive things in just a fraction of a second to keep us alive. It's a pretty big deal, right? Like we want to be alive. So you can imagine you press that button so many times and the brain is like, yay, survive, yay, survive, yay, survive, yay, survive. Then you take that thing away. And this is why recovery is so difficult and why it's hard to do this on our own. We take that thing that has been tied to our survival away, and the brain goes, holy shit, we are in super red flag, stop everything, panic time, we are about to die. Work? Who needs to go to work right now? You are gonna die. Forget about work. You gotta survive. Family? Come on, how are you gonna help your family if you're dead, which you're about to be right now? Morality, integrity, wow, we can think about that later when we're alive, which we might not be if we don't do this survival thing immediately. You got to push that button. Does it make sense out in the world? No, it seems like we're nuts, right? It seems like we're totally insane. But think about it. When people perceive that their lives are being threatened, they'll do some pretty bizarre things. We'll do just about anything, right? Now, that might happen if, say, someone sees a bear or they are at gunpoint. That might happen every now and again. We've been pushing that survival button over and over and over and over and over and over exponentially for years or decades. Do you get why this is so difficult? And that's just the biological part of it, right? That's just what's going on in the brain. Now, we've tied a lot of things into that, right? And so now, and we get shame in there. What is shame? What is guilt? What do those trigger? Oh, stress and anxiety. Where do those live? The limbic system. And a cycle goes, right? Stress, anxiety. Please keep in mind that limbic system that deals with our fear, it does not understand the difference between anxiety, which is a perceived threat to our lives. That's all it understands. That's what the brain is here to do, right? This system only understands survival of life. So say you're afraid to go and have a meeting with your boss, right? Is your boss going to murder you? Probably not. But that anxiety tells the brain that your life is being threatened. So now we're activating that survival mode. What do we need to survive? Pornography, voyeurism, fantasy, infidelity, all of these things. Or maybe it's a substance, maybe it's a food, whatever. It doesn't actually make sense that those things are going to keep us alive, but we're not actually about to die either, right? So the sense of it, throw it out the window. This is what is happening in the brain. So we have shame. The brain goes, oh, our life is being threatened. Push the button. Let's act out. Let's react out. We are reacting to those triggers that are hardwired now, not hardwired, because we can alter it, but they are now wired into our brains, right? I used to, when I would feel really upset, I would also feel really aroused. And I thought, this is fucked up. These shouldn't go together. But the thing is, when I would be upset in my earlier life, I would react out. Upset, react out. Upset, react out. And the brain goes, aha, pattern. The brain loves patterns. The brain is all about being lazy in the sense that it wants to exert as little energy as possible because it may need to help you survive later when your boss is about to murder you, right? So it wants to conserve energy as much as it possibly can. Therefore, when we pattern things together like that, upset, react out, upset, react out, get stressed out, watch pornography. It goes, aha, pattern. I'm going to wire these together. As the saying goes, those that fire together, wire together. So then all of a sudden, upset, also reacting out. And they're going together involuntarily on our part because the brain has now fused those together. Super great for habits that we enjoy and positive things that we want in our life. And we'll talk about this later, how to use that to our advantage. Not super great when these things are unhealthy for us, unwanted, they become compulsive, and of course they cause us harm too, right? And they cause harm in our lives and with our loved ones. So all of a sudden, our brain is kind of working against us. And let's give it a break, right? It doesn't understand anything about like what's going on. Like, yes, our brain is where understanding comes from, but that's a different system in the brain. Now, here's the kicker. This is the real bitch. When we are caught chronically in that limbic system, in the reward system that addiction is tied to, we actually have less access to the parts of our brain where analysis and judgment and discernment and understanding of consequences lives, right? That prefrontal cortex, that newer part of our brain where we're able to go, if I do this thing, this will happen, which will then result in this and this and this, and I don't want those things, so I'm not going to do that thing. Yeah, that's not happening the same way or even at all with someone that has addiction going on in the brain. So it's not like we're idiots, right? We're not stupid. It's just that our brain isn't functioning properly. And until we heal the brain, we don't really have a great shot at a normal, healthy, happy life. And because those things are wiring together and they're firing together and it's setting off that system in the brain that goes, oh, die, react out, you're gonna die, react out, you're gonna die, watch pornography. We are not having the ability to have the analysis and to make a change until we actually stop the cycle, stop that system from engaging. We got to stop pushing the button. That is why sobriety is so important. It's not the end, it is the beginning of the boldly satisfying life. Because as long as we're still pushing that button, we're still engaging that system in the brain and we're not able to get out of it. So that's why it's compulsive, because this stuff is just happening. We see a trigger. Maybe it's a particular type of clothing, or the way a particular type of look, or an area of town that you've reacted out in before, or maybe a massage parlor you've gone to before, or a website, right? And all of a sudden, compulsively, we are like, I've got to go react out. Nothing's going on, but all of a sudden, I have this compulsion that I have to go watch pornography. I have to go to that massage parlor. I have to go see a prostitute. I have to cheat on my spouse. Because those hedonic hotspots, again, that's what's going on, where we go, the thing, survival, go do that thing. Like, yes, this is a good thing, even though it's not a healthy thing for us, but it's a survival thing. I'm hoping you're picking up what I'm putting down at this point and understanding why this is so difficult. Now, there's more, but wait, there's more. Addiction is also hereditary, which means it is passed down. Not always, and even if you have addiction in your family, it doesn't necessarily mean that your offspring are going to have addiction as well. It just makes it more likely. And that's because not addiction itself. We've heard, like, back in the day, they talked about addiction being like an allergy that you inherit and things like that. That's not really what's going on. It's actually the setup, the makeup of our brain and our neurotransmitters that's hereditary, and that gets passed down. So for those of us that have an imbalance in those neurotransmitters like dopamine and serotonin and those things, when we already have an imbalance, then the brain is trying to rebalance it by boosting it, by encouraging us to do things that play right into that reward system. It's not trying to be an asshole, it's trying to help. It's like, oh, you have an imbalance in this, and I know how to boost that. And I'm going to encourage you to do things that boost that in order to balance out these chemicals that aren't quite right. So that's what's going on. So some of us are already born with a predisposition for addiction. Now, there's still more. What? I know it's kind of complicated, right? And this is the simple version. We could talk about this for hours. We know that early childhood trauma also plays a role when addiction is in the mix. Now, is that because it is hurtful and we want to find a way to feel better? Yes, kind of. On the outside, that is what's going on. But on the inside, guess who's at work? If you said the brain, you are correct. When we experience trauma, and we'll talk a little bit more about what that is, it changes our brain chemistry. And what does the brain do? It tries to help us rebalance it by pushing that button for the reward system. And so, yes, we are trying to find ways to cope, to numb out, or to feel better, but there's actually a biological thing going on as well. So when we have trauma in the mix, it actually changes the brain, and it changes our chemicals and how they are received. And it's just a total ripoff that we have. I mean, it's great. We have so much. There's abundance. There's everything you could ever want. But when we already have chemicals that are out of balance and a brain that's already predispositioned for that system to try to correct itself, then it's really easy to fall into addiction. We push that button enough and it becomes compulsive, and then it's on a loop on its own, and now it's out of our control. So that's what's going on. You're not a shitty person. You're not without discipline. It's not that your willpower sucks. We're going to talk about willpower in a later lesson. It's really, you have a malfunction of your brain system that has particular symptoms that go with it, and this reoccurs over and over and over time. That's what's going on with addiction. That's why trauma really does play a part, because it changes the brain and then the brain's trying to balance us back out. All working in service to our best and highest good. The brain's doing its job, helping us survive. It's just in today's day and age that has gotten completely out of whack. The good news is we know all of that. Yay, science. And there are ways to heal it. The brain is malleable, it remains teachable and shapeable for our entire lives. And just as that process happened involuntarily, especially for most of us, addiction didn't start in our teens and 20s, right? It really is something that started when we're quite young for most of us, that pushing of the button. And then it was like too much pushing of the button. And there are other things that go into that with the brain as well that tries to guard us when we like try to push the button too much, and that also adds and plays into addiction. It's just a whole smorgasbord of being set up for, you know, failure with regard to a happy and healthy life. But that's okay, because that stuff can be reversed. I am not a believer that once you're an addict, you're always an addict, and it's going to be in the parking lot waiting for you, and the moment you let your guard down, it will attack you. That's not what's going on. It's not this elusive creature living inside of us. It's just some shit happening in the brain, and we know about it and we can change it. The thing is, just as you may have found, addiction found its way to permeate itself into all parts of life because it's controlling your main operating system. Recovery has to do the same thing, which is why the path of self-mastery is, in my opinion, the most effective way to have a boldly satisfying life as a person with addiction. I actually believe that we have a better chance at a boldly satisfying life than those without addiction. We'll talk more about that. The more you get to know me, the more you'll hear how I believe that so truly and so deeply. Now, a real quick note about trauma, because not everybody has experienced it or has the understanding that they've experienced it. We often think of trauma as a really big, terrible event happening, or something happening consistently like abuse going on. And yes, that does happen for many people with addiction. They have those types of trauma in their past. Sexual abuse, physical abuse, mental, emotional, spiritual, all of those things. Yes, that can be present. But let's think about trauma real quick from the point of view of a child. When we are little, we rely on those around us to keep us alive, for our survival. So everything is much higher stakes at that point. So if we are, in biological makeup, perceived that we're not accepted in the tribe, we would die. And so that whole, like, peer pressure is a real thing because we're designed to be in community. Yay, that's what we do here in the recovery tribe. But we are designed to be in community and to be accepted, or else we would have died. You couldn't make it on your own back in the day, right? You would die. And so even things that the kid perceives, oh, if I don't do this, or if I say this, or I act this way, or whatever, I won't be accepted and then I'll die, right? So the littlest things to a child actually can turn into that, especially if it is consistent over time. It could be just dysfunction or disruption in the household. Without having consistent parenting, without that reliability, we as kids feel a threat to our actual lives, because everything's a threat to our actual lives when we're children, and especially how the brain perceives it. If we're left home alone, right? If we are neglected, if we are just feeling unsafe, that's really what it comes down to, a perceived sense of unsafety, especially built up over time. Now we're talking trauma for a kid. I'm going to keep saying that because we often think about, like, well, that wouldn't bother me. Well, yeah, because we're adults now, right? And we know, and we've grown up and we have developed. But as children, we don't know. We know nothing. And we are really in survival mode all the time, which has us primed wonderfully in that limbic system for this shit to take hold, which then it usually does. So, you know, it doesn't have to be this big, horrible thing that happened, like sexual abuse or, you know, something like that. It doesn't have to be that, and it also can. It can be any perceived unsafety consistently over time as a kid, in the thinking of a kid. So that's why that plays a part. It changes our brain chemistry, which then the brain tries to rebalance by having us push the buttons. That sets off the reward thing. It's all chemical, right? And it shows up in our lives, in our day-to-day, through our behaviors, which are really just the symptoms, which is why in this program we talk about mastering the self underlying addiction, not just the symptoms that result of it. Now, that same thing is happening with every area of addiction. There's not different parts of the brain like, oh, you know, alcohol addiction lives here and brain addiction or drug addiction's over here in this part of the brain and sex addiction, oh, that's back here, right? It's all the same system going on. It just depends on what we've been pushing that button around. So what system, what part of, what substance or behavior has been wired into those hedonic hotspots that then create the bigger triggers. Now, drugs are a little different because they don't just take advantage of the reward system, they actually block it or mimic it or enhance it. So there's a little bit of different things going on, but it's still working in that same part of the brain. So it might be like sex addiction was my main area because I started pushing that button for those types of behaviors really young. Those things got wired, they're always being fired, and that cycle is really well worn in there, right? We talk about grooves in the brain and we're grooving, right? No, we're talking about grooves in the brain, and the more we walk those paths, the deeper they get, right? And the more ingrained they feel. So I walked those paths in the brain. I set those paths in motion more often than other areas that are also in my wheelhouse, if you will. Because, you know, really, once that is going on in the brain, then anything that plays into that reward system can become an area of addiction for us. So that is just a little rundown of what's going on with addiction and why it's so problematic for us in our behaviors, in our signs and symptoms of it, and also why it's so important that we stop pushing that button. Now, I want to just say real briefly, because we're going to touch on this quite a lot throughout this program, that what we were doing when we were pushing that button initially, and why we still do that, is because we have a perfectly appropriate need that we are attempting to meet in an inappropriate way. So if, say, I was a kid and I felt unsafe, I felt stressed, I would do something that would make me feel better, right? Which is those chemicals are like, hey, we like this, this feels good. So I would do something that would make me feel better to try to meet that need of wanting to be safe. It's appropriate to want to be safe and to expect safety. Is watching pornography or masturbating actually meeting that need? No, it's just masking the feeling that comes with the need. So most of our triggers are emotion-based, really. We're emotional beings. They're feeling-based, and we are usually just trying to alter the feeling instead of meet the need. So what we're going to talk about a lot in this program, and we'll go over this in a later lesson, is how those are appropriate needs. Connection, intimacy, safety, those are all appropriate needs that we've just not been very skillful in meeting in appropriate ways. So a lot of the recovery work, really, when we break it down to its simplest form, is finding healthy ways to meet healthy needs and not just masking the uncomfortable feeling that comes with a need not being met. We're going to actually figure out the needs and then build a really sufficient toolkit to actually meet the need. Because then what happens if we're actually meeting those needs, we don't have the desire to cover up the uncomfortable feeling that comes with an unmet need. That is holistic recovery. That is the path to a boldly satisfying life. And I look forward to talking more about it with you in the weeks to come. If you have any questions or anything, make sure to bring them to our recovery tribe session this week, and you can also include them in the comments below. Thanks so much for your time. I'll see you soon.